centuries ago, the terrain of the Mississippi Delta was a tangled labyrinth of bayous and swamps, dissected by the behemoth Mississippi River. In general, the only land available for civilization skirted this great river. This was not simply coincidence. Thousands of years of flooding deposited silt from as far away as Minnesota on its banks. Beyond these natural levees built by the river lie hundreds of miles of brackish marshland. It would have been difficult to imagine this treacherous landscape growing into the nation's third largest city in little over a century. The history of New Orleans is one of human desires pressed against the limits of the natural world. Those settling in New Orleans have faced an endless struggle to keep the waters at bay. With this in mind, historian Pierce Lewis once called New Orleans the inevitable city on the impossible site. The catastrophe spawned by Hurricane Katrina calls into question what has historically been an adversarial relationship between humans and their surrounding environment. In 1718, Frenchman Jean-Baptiste Lamont Bienville established New Orleans as Louisiana's capital. He hoped it would become a fortress, controlling the wealth of the North American interior.
New Orleans was founded as a port city to control this entire Mississippi River basin.
Although the location was ideal for economic prosperity, the land or lack of land made it difficult to develop, with a constant threat of flooding, hurricanes, and disease.
So what Bienville did and his associates was to begin to set up crude levees, so that would begin the first attempt, which lasted for 300 years, to try to tame the Mississippi River. And this what we can call the Great New Orleans Experiment.
As agricultural land expanded around the city, landowners were required to erect their own levees. These laws were enacted because the city's economic success depended on its immediate hinterland, as well as trade on the river. Privately constructed levee systems were structurally inferior and often failed. Even so, 50 miles of levees stretched upstream from New Orleans by 1763. Racked by levee failures, disease, and debt, the French sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States government in 1803. The addition of Louisiana to the U.S. was inevitable due to the rapid westward expansion of the young republic, one increasingly dependent on the Mississippi River for trade and commerce. Following the Louisiana Purchase, New Orleans continued to expand its system of levees, adding an increasingly complex canal system to aid in the draining process. However, it was apparent by mid-century that the levees wouldn't hold back the water forever.
I find myself forced to the conclusion that the entire dependence on the leveeing system is not only unsafe for us, but I think will be destructive to those who will come after us. A.D. Wooldridge, State Engineer, 1850.
Protecting the city through these unnatural means proved problematic in ways the city planners couldn't have imagined. Water draining from reclaimed land caused sediments to slump relative to the surrounding marsh, while the system of levees and canals prevented new sediment from taking its place. Approaching its heyday, the Crescent City was slowly, inexorably sinking. At the turn of the 20th century, New Orleans was one of the most prosperous cities in America, a boom town through which flowed the economic lifeblood of the nation. The prosperity of the city was intimately tied to the port. The more grain and timber that floated downstream, the more the city grew. New Orleans was getting hungry for land, and land was what it lacked the most.
So this was a spit of land, and when you left the river, then you left that levee, and when you left that levee, you entered into the swamp that covered New Orleans. And to settle in that swamp was difficult indeed.
Despite these environmental challenges, the city's appetite for land was insatiable. Development began north of the natural levees, and a new era had begun. For the first time, neighborhoods in New Orleans were being constructed below the level of the sea. Although developers and real estate agents would have considered the newly drained lands to be dry, the residents may have disagreed. Sidewalks, streets, even whole houses sank into the settling mud.
The first developments out there discovered that if you drained the land and built houses, there was a huge problem with subsidence. And as the soil subsided, the sewer connections, the gas and the water connections all poured loose. In some areas, the soil went down 8 to 11 feet out there. And so that became a very difficult problem.
Although these neighborhoods have been reclaimed from wild nature, the encroaching and ever-present water served to remind residents that the land was only borrowed. The city's solution to drainage was technological and came from the tireless efforts of one man, a precocious and brilliant engineer by the name of A. Baldwin Wood. Wood's genius was as a pump designer. He held 38 patents, the most important of which were his giant screw pump and trash pump, which moved mountains of water quickly uphill. Giant pumps based on Wood's designs quickly made the city a more habitable place. Ditches and sewers could be drained continuously, and the pumps could keep pace with all but the heaviest of downpours. Baldwin Wood worked for the Sewage and Water Board until his death in 1957. A focused man, he had but two passions: his job and sailing his sloop, Nydia, around the sounds and marshes that skirted the city. He called this communing with nature. Wood's passion for sailing borders on the ironic. As he communed with nature, Wood's inventions were steadily removing it from the city of New Orleans. The limits that had once confined New Orleans to the natural levee systems of the Mississippi and adjoining bayous were decisively beaten, but it was commerce that would drive the city's expansion into the 1920s. The completion of the industrial canal between the Mississippi and the lake in 1923 was a windfall for the shipping industry. Bulk cargo barges finally had a quick way to move between the Mississippi and the Intercoastal Waterway. The Great Depression slowed growth in the city, but also brought an exceptional amount of federal money for public works. Highway projects during the 20s and 30s greatly enhanced the city's land connections to the rest of the country. Federal money literally paved the way for the city's further development of low-lying areas. New Deal road and rail projects placed New Orleans in a position to harness the economic drive of the country during the Second World War. This era heralded the city's greatest period of industrial expansion. Overnight, the waterfront of Lake Pontchartrain was transformed into a military-industrial complex of massive proportions, accommodating shipyards, factories, and even a POW camp for German prisoners. In the post-war era, the city's drainage capacity was greatly enhanced. New pipelines were laid, canals were improved, and pumping stations added. By 1970, the city of New Orleans contained 167 miles of canals, 45 miles of pipeline, and 14 pumping stations, capable of moving 28,000 cubic feet of water per second. Throughout New Orleans, the terrain was being altered in ways unimaginable. In little more than a year, marshland could be transformed into a concrete landscape of ranch-style homes. As Bienville had imagined 200 years prior, New Orleans had truly become a fortress. Not one to repel colonial powers, but instead one to shield the city from nature itself.
What's happened since the 1960s is that very low land was developed. Very, very low land. On the other side of the industrial canal, development began to occur, and that was basically marsh.
With the completion of Interstate 10, the city began to surge eastward. Swamps were drained and filled for the New Orleans East Corporation, creating room for expansion that now covers almost a quarter of Orleans Parish. To be clear, the draining and development of New Orleans East was an extremely bold move. Not only was the land far below sea level, but the marshes that had protected it were increasingly ravaged by erosion and development. The Mississippi River Gulf Outlet Channel was opened in the late 1960s, cutting through the heart of New Orleans' protective marshland. Without wetlands to slow the pace of storm surge, the channel was a hurricane highway, bringing a wall of water to New Orleans' doorstep. The loss of wetlands jeopardized more than just New Orleans East. Throughout the Delta region, protective marsh was being destroyed at a breakneck pace. In the 1960s and 70s, enough marshland disappeared in the Mississippi Delta every day to cover nearly 700 football fields. The shipping channels caused seawater to intrude, killing the freshwater marsh. Additionally, over the last century, river levees built by the Army Corps of Engineers have prevented the regular flooding of the delta, halting the natural process of land deposition.
You could say that the Mississippi River had become caged and it no longer flooded. And right from 1930 to today, each year, 300 million tons of sediments flow right out of the mouth of the Mississippi River and out to the continental shelf and falls over into the deeper part of the Gulf of Mexico into oblivion.
The modern environmental movement led to significant thought over the wisdom of the city's development schemes. Starting in the 1970s, a movement to restore wetlands in the region began. The Bayou Sauvage Refuge east of New Orleans and the Barataria Preserve south of the city showed a modest effort to prevent further wetlands depletion. By 2005, the city had 1,480 miles of pipes and canals, moving 47,000 cubic feet of water per second, all attempting to keep the impossible city dry. With a century of wetlands depletion, the sea had crept ever closer to the walls of New Orleans, and not even the most complex flood protections in the world could defend against a large hurricane. Officials had hoped that an investment of $1.8 billion would be able to raise the drainage capacity to handle an inch of rain an hour. But these improvements would not come soon enough, nor would they have been strong enough to cope with what was to come. The 2005 hurricane season was the most active on record, with 25 named storms, 5 being a Category 4 or higher. The Gulf Coast saw 6 storms make landfall. And on Saturday, August 27th, the National Hurricane Center in Miami issued a hurricane warning for the central Gulf Coast. Hurricane Katrina was drifting slowly at 7 miles per hour through the boiling Gulf waters. The predictions and fears of 3 centuries were suddenly realized. Alright, this is the house of a friend of the family. I'm just going to take a stroll through it. The worst part is probably the ceiling. This is all mold. This is all mold. The torrential rains and storm surge from Katrina pushed the canal system of New Orleans to its breaking point. 3 major levee breaches occurred on the 17th Street Canal, the London Avenue Canal, and the Industrial Canal. Water pressure from inside the walls, coupled with a softening of the soil, led to large parts of the retaining wall toppling over. 80% of the city was submerged. The 9th Ward, New Orleans East, and Lakeview communities suffered the most. Those unable to evacuate were left to fend for themselves. Hundreds perished in the ensuing madness, and untold thousands of homes and lives sat ruined in the stagnant water. Not coincidentally, these sections are the most recently developed, and many times the poorest.
What I'm looking at, and it's a very obnoxious choice, is that that doesn't need to be redeveloped. I mean, the real thing that should happen there is that should be returned to some kind of wetlands, which it was to start off with.
The older portions of the city along the natural levee remain largely unscathed. Those responsible for the Crescent City's development were convinced that the city's survival was based on taming the environment. Pipes, canals, levees, and pumps were all fortifications in a 3-century-long siege. They failed. With the images of Katrina fresh in the American consciousness, important questions need to be asked about the relationship between humans and nature. Is it necessary to see the environment as a foe or a hindrance? This perception cost the city dearly. While billions of dollars were spent on fortifications, these solutions served to undermine the city's natural protections, while ensuring that the land would continue to sink. Most importantly, how should human development meet natural integrity? As a society, can we afford to continue building higher walls when the same natural systems that bring us catastrophe also protect us? If there's one lesson that the history of New Orleans teaches us, it's that when humanity views nature as merely an adversary, it opens itself up to ruin.
Do you know what it means to miss New Orleans and miss her each night and day? I know I'm not wrong, because the feeling's getting stronger the longer I stay away. Mr. Moss-covered pines, tall sugar pines, where mockingbirds used to sing. And I'd love to see that old lazy Mississippi whirring in the spring. Moonlight on the bayous, Creole tunes fill the air. I dream about magnolias in June, and I'm wishing I was there. Do you know what it means to miss New Orleans when that's where you left your heart? And there's one thing more, I miss the one I care for more than I miss New Orleans. Go on, Doc. on the bayous, Creole tunes fill the air, and I dream about magnolias in June. You know I'm wishing right now I was there. Do you know what it means to miss New Orleans when that's where you left your heart? And there's one thing more I miss, the one I care for more than I miss New Orleans. More than I miss New Orleans.